Thank you very much. Thank you, Gabriel, Klaus, and everyone for having me. So this is my ambition before, contacting Gabriel was to do something much broader picture. Unfortunately, the time I had here was very short, so I ended up just focusing on that specific paper. Which would be more of a research talk as a result. But at the end, I will try to open up the discussion for a broader topic. So hopefully Brigitte can also take it from there. And my apologies for the complication. So the paper is a very basic, very simple paper. It tries and make a basic point, which is that as we know, the global financial crisis had a huge impact on not just on the U.S. economy, but also on the broader economy here. We'd like to contrast that shock with the 9/11 shock in thinking about the consequences for developing countries, and in particular on aid. And 9/11 is quite a traumatic event for the US, but for the whole Western world in terms of how the Western world apprehended conflict and in particular terrorism. And I must say that in my discussion in the Middle East and in many parts of the world, it was very clear that the salience of terrorism or conflict, the global salience, there was a before and an after 2011 when it comes to the global salience of terrorism and conflict, meaning that prior to 9/11, countries that were experiencing conflict didn't feel much attention on the part of the Western, the donor community, that is, as opposed to after 9/11, where Western donors started to realize the importance of fighting terrorism and the importance of also helping countries with conflict. And so the paper, the motivation is to try and make the case that this shock, while short-lived in terms of economic impact on the U.S. economy, had an important ripple effect on aid. And we posit that the mechanisms through which this shock has affected the aid industry was through what I call a preference shock, if you wish. So the Western donors are traditionally the main donor. Of course, of late, China, others, India, Turkey, and others have emerged as important donors as well. But traditionally, the Western community has been really the beacon of the aid industry. So anything that affects the preferences of donor may have an impact on the aid community. So is to say that the motivation is really based on that notion that while this is a relatively small shock from an economic standpoint in the US and in the Western world, it had huge effect on the aid, on the behavior that they have toward the developing world. Of course, what's well known from 9/11 is the security response. So there was a so-called global war on terror, a very controversial war on terror. The invasion of, I believe, Afghanistan first and then Iraq were a very controversial move on the part of the US. And of course, followed a very important renewed cooperation on security, which is perhaps less controversial. But that part has been well studied. There was a lot of attention paid to that. Here, this paper really just takes the sliver of the development aid and looks at, before and after 9/11. That's essentially the paper. And in contrast to the 2008 global financial crisis, that shock had also a huge impact through the income channel of rich country on the aid community. But that's a less interesting shock, if you wish, because it's a mechanical shock running from less income in the global north or in the Western world, leading to a drying out of aid in developing countries. Here, it's a short-lived shock from an economic standpoint, 9/11, but it had a dramatic implication for aid. So that's why we argue it's a preference shock. So that's really the thrust of the paper, and what follows is just a bunch of regressions and data to make the case stronger, hopefully evidence-based. So the main takeaway from the result is that we find that the relationship between armed conflict, but also terror attacks, and aid commitment changed over time. So it went from negative, meaning that countries that experience conflict, there was a so while you're fixing the slide, let me continue. So we find that the relationship between conflict in recipient country and aid went from negative before 2001 to positive after 2001. That's the main result. We find that this to be robust to the inclusion of terror attack as opposed to armed conflict. We also find this to be robust to the inclusion of debt relief. Those who know about development know that the early 2000s were a period of debt relief, an important period of debt relief. So there could be some confounding factors to the result, meaning that the debt relief may have spurred more aid, more loans, if you wish, as well, to developing country, and this might be coincidental to what we're finding. So we debunked that argument by doing a bunch of tests, and including looking at the composition of aid and showing that it's mostly grants, not loans. And we've also introduced dummies for specific countries' decision related to debt relief as well. But I'll go into detail very shortly. So the bottom line is that we argue that the result confirm. We argue it's driven by a preference shock, and the most important takeaway, and that could be useful for discussion, is that this confirms what I describe as the primacy of donors' preference over recipient needs. And again, from my discussion in many countries in the global south, clearly there was a view that prior to 9/11 there was very little salience of conflict among the donor community, but after it became salient. So that's a good thing, but it also reveals that for other topics, for other priorities, that may be the case, and this calls for potentially a rethink of aid. And that's the topic I'm trying to take on with colleagues at the IMF. On conflict, but also on natural disaster, natural resources, and I'm happy to talk about that if there is an interest. So this is a basic graph showing the evolution of bilateral aid commitment. I can explain why we focus on bilateral aid as opposed to multilateral, but for now, so this is in real term, and there's clearly a break in 2001 in the evolution. Of course, there are countries where 9/11 is a tricky shock. I mentioned Afghanistan and Iraq because they were directly involved in this global war on terror. But in select number of countries, clearly there was also that structural break, also for countries like Nigeria, which has been subject to quite a bit of terrorism after 2001. So those are aid commitment, not disbursement. And I will argue that it is important for us to address the issue of causality, and I'll make a case around this very shortly. And so to position this paper in this debate, including the policy debate, but also the academic literature on aid, I must say that it was in my discussion with Bill Easterly, who is one of the most prominent contributors to the aid literature. It appeared that indeed up to 2000, the early 2000, the aid literature was focused on the so-called aid effectiveness, to the idea that aid shouldn't go to corrupt countries, it should be effective, and governance was key in the allocation, in the way we allocate our donor allocate aid. So clearly that literature took a hit in 2001 and started to fall. These are data from Google Books showing the trends in published monographs on aid effectiveness versus fragile states. So while the literature on aid effectiveness peaked in 2001 and then started to fall shortly after, in parallel is a bit of a scissor effect. In parallel, the literature on conflict started to rise, meaning that the salience again, and here when I say global salience, I mean global in the sense of Western, the Western community, given the importance of donor, Western donor in the aid industry. So the salience of conflict and terrorism, here it's not showing. So fragile state became a phrase of very important in the publication of this monograph. So meaning that this illustrates how there are of course lots of polls on the importance of terrorism in the US, but also elsewhere. So this is well documented. But yeah, I also wanted to show that in the literature, clearly, us as academic, we're also very much influenced by outside events, so we have an internal logic. This clearly made a lot of people much more interested in conflict, while conflict did occur much earlier. So I can explain more for those who are interested. So just quickly on the literature. So there's what we're trying to do is to basically kind of merge two literature. So the literature on foreign aid. So I spoke about the aid allocation, but also there's a whole literature on aid effectiveness. There was a big gap between papers by Easterly and others, which literature peaked in 2000. And then most recent paper by colleagues, former colleagues at the bank, showing that there was issues with corruption associated with aid allocation. So the revival of aid effectiveness is a very recent phenomenon. There was really an enormous gap for 20 years, and one must ask why. At the same time, the literature on conflict exploded. Edouard Miguel and many others have contributed to that. And again, very relevant literature, but one must ask why not before 2001? Why was it so little studied? And suddenly 2001 just made not just the terrorism study, but any conflict study very relevant and very publishable, if you wish. So there are also a couple of interesting papers on media coverage in the US, and how it affects donors' behavior. That's a paper in the QGE. There's also a paper by Easterly who in line with his earlier work, document that 2000, and that's a concomitant paper, we didn't communicate on this, where he shows that after 2001, he shows that aid went more disproportionately to bad governance countries. And this basically further is critique, a very harsh critique of the aid industry, saying that aid is not used properly, it's not going to the right country. So it's a slightly different angle, but also documenting that prior 2001 and post 2001, we I think are taking a slightly different angle by articulating this shock as a preference shock and documenting it from a reduced form standpoint. So I'm going to skip the data. I mean, these are well-known data. So very basic empirical approach. I know Gabriel is a very big expert on gravity models, so hopefully I haven't done too many mistakes there. So we use a gravity model, and we focus on bilateral aid. Of course, there's aid by the World Bank and other multilateral institutions. This is about 30%, including the European Commission. This is about 30% of global aid. Here we focus on bilateral aid because we wanted to exploit that bilateral relationship. We've taken a look at multilateral aid, but because by definition multilateral aid is hard to match donors and individual donors and recipients, we put that aside. So it's a very basic equation that we test. On the right-hand side, we have the occurrence, the onset of conflict, and on the left-hand side, ODA, commitment, not disbursement. So it's the start of a conflict on the decision to allocate, not the actual aid being dispersed. And then we have a bunch of controls. We also test a potential alternative explanation, which is that countries that are more politically aligned with each other, donor and recipient, whether or not this influence the empirical relationship that we are documenting between conflict and aid. And we find no strong effect, or nothing going into the direction that there was a selective approach to allocating aid in conflict-affected countries. So it was rather, not a privileged relationship that influenced this change, this shift in sign of the aid allocation. Let me say a word of causality. Of course, I know the profession is obsessed with causality for good reason. But here I'm going to try and get away or get out of that of that challenge by simply quoting Morris. And I think it's common sense that terrorist attack or conflict, at least the timing of this conflict, they comport a strategic element of surprise. I mean, it's even more so for terrorist attack. Clearly, terrorists strike in a very, unexpected way. Otherwise, you won't succeed. So we argue that there is an element of surprise, but we also have evidence from a paper by Nathan Nunn and Kian, which is an interesting paper, I think also in the QG, where they are basically looking at specific aid shipment, food aid shipment on conflict, and they find evidence that triggers conflict, but they can't specifically determine the timing of conflict with the aid shipment. They find that it's associated, but they can't pin down the onset of conflict with their data. And I must say that they are looking at actual delivery of aid. What we try to do is use commitment of aid as opposed to delivery, because we think that if you combine the argument that the timing of conflict the specific timing is arguably exogenous. The decision, the change in decision to allocate more or less aid because it's just a commitment, not an actual delivery. We argue that we are on the right side of the issue of causality. But I'm happy to discuss this further. So this is the main result of the equation of the gravity model that we are estimating, and we find indeed that while overall the relationship between conflict and aid is negative, when we split the sample with a simple sample split prior to 2001 and after, the sign of the relationship between conflict and aid shift from negative to positive. And this is mostly driven by relatively major conflict as opposed to minor conflict. And we also, because of the arbitrary nature of that sample split, we also try and see, using a rolling window, whether this arbitrary split is, makes a difference in the robustness of our result. Broadly speaking, we find that the relationship is fairly negative prior to 2000, and of course there is an episode here, and I should flag that there is this episode where the relationship between conflict and aid turned negative even after 2001. But of course, that's 2007, 2008 crisis, which is a mechanical on the effect of that crisis on aid. Western donor country faced that slump in growth, and as a result, reduced their aid. So that notwithstanding, we find that broadly speaking, there's a negative before and a positive. So what also led us to think about terrorism more specifically as opposed to conflict was this result, where we tried to look at a different type of conflict. What became interesting was that the result appeared to be driven, by internal armed conflict, but more so by what is called the internationalized conflict, meaning that conflict where there is a third party, and many of these conflicts have to do with coalitions, of Western or non-Western country trying to come to the rescue, which indicated that there could be some beside armed conflict, terrorism might also be an important driver of our results. So we used that University of Maryland dataset, very rich dataset on conflict, and substituted the armed conflict dummy variable that we used with very detailed data on the number of casualties, number of hostages, and we find the result to be very impressively robust, the shift in sign across the number of wounded, number of killed, number of kidnapped, number of damage value. Across the board, we find a relationship between terrorist attack, whether it's from a damage or number of people injured or fatalities, to go from negative to positive. And so another dimension which is interesting to explore in light of what, and trying to explore what could be driving the result is the, what type of aid might change as a result of that of conflict in recipient country. And here, what we see is that purpose aid, as opposed to non-purpose aid. For those who know development, they know that non-purpose aid is basically aid that is not tied to a specific sector or specific use. So purposes was driving is driving the result, and it is not driven by debt-related relief. Quite the contrary. But it's driven by, both health and humanitarian and social infrastructure. So, which further our point that, development aid, maybe that's not the appropriate term, but aid here is really, it confirms our insight that it might be indeed the preference of donor may have shifted toward helping, supporting countries that have experienced whether conflict or terrorist act, because humanitarian and social infrastructure would be absolutely needed in this context. We also looked at the difference between grants and loan, and if this hypothesis that aid would be driven by concomitant debt relief, then countries would be more creditworthy or aid-worthy from a loans perspective. Here we don't find that loan respond in the context of the relationship between conflict and aid. Again, furthering our point that this is not driven by debt relief initiative. When we test whether this is all driven, this relationship between the shift in the sign of the relationship between conflict and aid, whether this is driven by a privileged relationship captured here by a proxy, whereby countries would vote alike, G7 country at the UN General Assembly, we find the result to actually go in the opposite direction as opposed to the one would have anticipated, so, and not super robust. To finish on the result, I'll just say that we've introduced debt relief initiative of the kind that were offered in 2000, where of course country specific. It was mostly Africa. I think it's 33 out of the 39, but they have specific decision point, completion point. So we use this information, plug into job dummies, and then specifically control for this, and find that this doesn't change our result. I also forgot to mention that there's a whole literature on whether military aid drives conflict or whether military aid drives the cooperation between major donors and recipient country. So we also we were able to gather data on U.S. aid, military aid, and we try and compare the relationship between aid and conflict. We didn't find anything significant or anything relevant. We also addressed the issue of too many zeros. There's other things that my RA is doing on the topic. I guess the most notable robustness is that when specifically and consecutively removing different regions, what we find, the region we find that are driving our result is Sub-Saharan Africa separately, and the Middle East and North Africa. And that's not surprising because those are two regions where conflict are pretty recurrent. And so we did the same rolling window with terrorist attack, and we find also pretty robust pattern here that the relationship went from negative to positive before and after 2001. To conclude, so I'll repeat the main result. So we find a robust relationship, a robust change in sign of the relationship between of conflict and aid after 2001. We find that it's grants, humanitarian driven as opposed to loan and debt related, and we conclude that this further the notion that there is a primacy of donor over recipient needs. And for further research, we're trying to use the appropriate econometric techniques to try and build, to move this paper to think about whether donors aid is effective in conflict-affected country. This is a big question, considering that conflicts are on the rise. And what we're trying to do is build a counterfactual whereby we could answer the question as to whether countries are better off, conflict-affected countries are better off with than without the intervention of donors. And I think this is overdue, given how this is becoming an important avenue of work for this donor community. The policy implication is that it seems that priorities have been swinging over time, sometimes here for good reason and the appropriate direction, but this raised bigger question as to whether we should find mechanism to elicitate recipient needs and understanding them better as opposed to just following waves. And of course, taxpayer money in donor community should be, taxpayers should drive the discussion, but the issue of preference might actually come in the way of the effectiveness of aid, both from an allocative and technical efficiency standpoint. I'll end here. Hopefully I didn't go too much over time.
That's it. Thank you. Thank you very much. I may now hand over to Birgit Meyer, who will provide a couple of comments. There we go. Let me just share the screen now, this time properly. How to get this full screen? There you go.
You have to click on the arrows.
Okay. So, yeah, thank you very much. It was a pleasure to read the paper. I tried to first embed it a bit more. I can't.
Then escape it.
Can't move to the next slide. Because I think it's a quite important issue to look at trade aid flows, in particular bilaterally. We have not just seen the increase in bilateral aid flows. Looking at the geoeconomic environment, we have also seen that, particularly for developing countries, also looking from 2000 onwards, we have seen massive increase in the integration of many developing countries into global markets. And that's important to also consider in this whole context. And with that, we have part of this is driven by China and Chinese activities also in Africa. But this is important to consider because while China has been a major aid recipient, it has now become a major donor. And of course, since the financial crisis, we have seen kind of a globalization, which has different reasons, also increasing international tensions, also related partly to conflicts and terrorism, and which also led to an increase of use of sanctions, trade policy instruments, not just tariff instruments, but also non-tariff measures. We have seen an increased protectionism, and with that, we have also seen a formation of geoeconomic blocks. So Western allies versus the East versus the rest of the countries. And with that, also, particularly the US has lost some kind of influence in world trade. And this is important to keep in mind when considering the aid and use of aid. Since aid is not just used as an instrument to prevent terror, it's also often used as instruments for economic reasons. So donors have quite different motives. So there are the more altruistic donors, like Sweden or the Netherlands. Then you have the more economic motivated donors and the more political motivated donors, like, for example, the US. And there's a huge literature also on these motives. You know them anyhow. So, and recently, we have seen that aid is used more and more as an geo-economic instrument. And this is also what you actually imply with your paper. We have seen that aid is particularly getting more targeted, and particularly with initiatives like the Aid for Trade initiative, aid has become one important policy instrument. And with the emergence of new donors like China, the economic motive has become even more important. We have in China the Belt and Road Initiative, which is also connected to Chinese aid flows, particularly to African countries. We have the US the G7 Build Back Better World initiatives, and the EU more recently also stepped into the game of using aid as geo-economic instrument. And even Austria is not anymore so altruistic. So Austrian aim of development assistance is actually to end poverty, so meet basic needs, which are still kind of the altruistic motives, but also makes the economy more sustainable, protect and preserve the environment, and also your terrorism motive or related to that, work for peace and security, which relates to humanitarian aid, and building exclusive societies and promoting women. So it's even written in there that you have these aims. And this is also what we see when we look at this more bilaterally. I show you here some bilateral comparisons of aid disbursements, not commitments. And here, this is also what you see in the overall, what you nicely showed in the overall graph for aid. You see the massive increase from 2001 onwards, but mainly for the US. And this is partly driven by what you actually showed. And for other countries, you have, so these are mainly European countries, you have more an increase from 2004, 5, and then after the crisis onwards, where you have an increase, particularly due to aid for trade, which consists of aid for infrastructure, aid for productivity development, and so forth. So you have some kind of purpose targets here also connected to aid. And with these bilateral aid flows, it's always important to look at these bilateral aid flows, but one should keep in mind when comparing the US to particularly other European countries, that in the EU, there's a much more multilateralism connected to donating. So a lot of these aid flows is not necessarily coming from individual member countries, but we're the EU as a whole. So this is something which one should keep in mind. But let's move more to your paper. It was a pleasure to read your paper because it shows that aid really can be used as instrument and really focuses on the motive, which is often stated and also stated partly for Austria to prevent global war of terror, where we had to provide peace and security in the case of Austria. And you look at this relationship between armed conflicts and non-military foreign aid, particularly looking at commitments, which I think in this case is also a good decision. And you focus on the bilateral aid flows, basically by looking at an aid allocation equation. And it's quite interesting to see this change in the relationship after 9/11, which marks really an increase in this political motivated aid flows. And it has also some important implication because you're really showing this instrumentalization of aid. I have some comments for you to improve the paper further. You should, like when reading the paper, you made it more clear when talking about it, but you should put like a clear definition how you define conflicts in the paper. And I was a bit wondering with your sample period, because as far as I know, PRIO, which you also used, starts in 1998, and you have data from 1980. So I was a bit wondering, because also with the improvement in the conflict data, you also have more conflicts in the data set, since how the data set is actually constructed is with news reports and so on. You have more conflicts nowadays than in the 90s and the 80s, not just because there are more conflicts, also because, well, the data is improved. And you need to be, when presenting the paper, you were a bit more cautious about it, but you make some quite strong hypotheses related to the causal relationship due to conflicts. So is this really causality, or is this like more trend you measure? Because I showed you this graph before where you have this massive increase of the bilateral aid for the US, but not necessarily by the other countries. You have a massive increase in aid for trades, which also increased the overall aid. So yeah. And you do not take into account that within your sample period, you have a lot of other things happening with the integration of developing countries more into the international trade. So this is something which you easily could use to include bilateral trade. And this also would help to actually improve your model. But let me also, I mean, there are more comments, but we can talk about bilaterally on that, because your model is also a bit problematic in the sense that it's a gravity-like model, since you model bilateral aid flows. But actually, on your right side of your model, you basically have only unilateral variables, which makes it a bit more difficult, except of your fixed effects. So if you really want to estimate a proper bilateral model and not like a more aid allocation model, you should think about to make your model and approach more bilaterally to really capture these bilateral effects and these bilateral motives. So there are several possibilities how to do that. I don't want to go through all in detail, but this is something which you should consider to really state and prove your hypothesis, since the motives of the donors, they're also bilateral. So these are basically my main comments, since you were looking at the time. Yeah, so thanks for the quite important paper.
Before we open the floor for the general discussion, would you like to reply?
Yeah, I mean, I just can thank you, Brigitte. These are great comments, well taken. And I must just say that I agree on the control. Of course, we have that fixed effect that wipe out all the bilateral, all the drivers that may be linked to time invariant relationship. And we have also a set of results where we I showed them where we interact the conflict data with this bilateral UN, pattern of voting. But you're right. We try and do more. I don't see how, but maybe you have ideas on variable that could be used as well. Otherwise, I think your discussion is great. I mean, we have China in there. We included it. We have some data on China, and anyway, the sample is unweighted. So whether it's the US or China, it doesn't appear to drive the result one way or another. But I guess isolating China, isolating the US could be interesting as well. But I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Gabriel.
Yes, thanks, Rabah, for a nice presentation. I have two remarks. The first is about the let's say the inverse of allowing aid where conflict happens. Could it not also be that aid that is that has been flowing is reversed if the security situation in the country, or the sponsoring of terrorism by the real government doesn't stop? So if we have this global sanctions database project with Yoto and Pastos, and there we code the withdrawal of aid or the change in the aid body or something like that as a sanction. And then often, when we look at the objectives of governments who change their aid strategy, then it is sometimes related to the presence of terrorism also. So there could be something that you want to control for.
Somehow what we're showing is that prior to 2001, there is a retraction effect. No? So in a sense, we're probably doing, we're doing a form of what you're documenting. Mm-hmm. So then we show that, then the net is positive after 2001. The net retrenchment becomes positive after. So I'm with you, but I think the retrenchment is what we have prior to 2001. But I look at how you build it.
It's more a remark, really. I think you're right what you say. But it could be interesting to build that bridge. And I think David also said this geo-economics motive is more important. The second, but it's becoming more important. The second remark is when I was at WIFO in Munich. I think it was 15 years ago. There was a FDP development minister, Dirk Niebelt, a very controversial person, and he publicly stated, we want to reorganize aid to better match German commercial interests. And he commissioned a study that the WIFO Institute carried out on whether the granting of bilateral aid does indeed increase bilateral exports. All right, so we give 50 million euros to Egypt, and then we want to see more exports of Germany to Egypt. And that was actually very strong. And it was not the FDP being in charge of that ministry, but it's something that was visible in data for long. So there was this motivation, commercial interest, mercantilistic interest. And if I follow your logic, then if we were to rerun those regressions, today, we would probably no longer find significance for this, or we should be rather maybe seeing the opposite, that the prime interest now of allowing bilateral aid in this case, of bilateral aid is not different. It's no longer the activation of international trade, but it's rather non-interested in the sense of pacifying those countries or of reducing the fertility of the ground there for secessionist or terrorist groups.
But this is fascinating because I think what Birgit was talking about was aid for trade was export from the recipient country to the donor country. What you're saying?
It's both.
Yeah, it's both, but I think the idea is to help export, development in the country so that they can export to bigger market. But what you're describing is import.
Yes.
That's an interesting thing to pursue. Yeah.
For trade is both. It's going in both, or it shall have impacts on both directions.
Next on the list is Klaus Nummer.
Yeah, thank you very much for your interesting talk. I have two questions as well. The first one is concerned with influential observations. So right after 9/11, the US invaded Iraq and then later Afghanistan. And given that the US is a big donor, I was wondering whether a lot of US donor money was now going to Iraq and Afghanistan. Okay, and if this is the case, whether excluding these two countries would affect the robustness of your results. And my second question is concerning remittances. Remittances are of increasing importance in recent years. I think they, having read that they now actually exceed official development aid. And I also remember reading a couple of years ago that development aid and remittances go in opposite directions, so they're negatively correlated. And I was wondering whether the flows of remittances, if they're negatively correlated with official development aid, whether this is still true after 2001. So I was just wondering if you ever looked at remittances using the same methodology or the same background.
I've done some paper on remittances, but I don't have anything in mind that comes. But yes, surely something interesting to look at, because this would be seen as a more, not market oriented type of flow, but at least more private flow. So it would be interesting to see how it behave related to more donor or public type of flow. Very important point. But I don't have an answer. Thank you.
And Thomas Grün, next on the list.
Yes. I have three small comments. One is the issue that you use the commitments rather than the disbursements. I think this is a good idea. It reminds me somehow about on the analysis of monetary policy actions, where you do not use the change in the interest rate itself. You use the announcement to change the interest rates as the explanatory variable. And I think this is a step towards this kind of reasoning. And then the other thing is about your idea that you are, so to say, analyzing something like a preference shock to development aid. And I think if I have a preference shock, you should also see some persistency in the change in the behavior. And maybe you have some test where you can.
The rolling window shows some persistency well after.
So I think if you stress the persistency aspect, this would be helpful to prove your notion of a preference shock. And the other thing where I can think of a way to improve the idea that there is a preference shock is if you compare, let's say, the development of US disbursement commitments relative to commitments done by Arab countries or by the OPEC fund, which should not have experienced the preference shock in the way that the Western donor countries have done. So maybe that's another avenue.
Thank you. It's 29 past. So if we have one last burning question. If we do not have a burner, then I would like to thank Rabah. I would also like to thank Birgit, the audience, and especially those of you who have provided comments. Thanks a lot, and have a lovely afternoon.